Smack! The sound of a slap cracked through the air. A black woman in her 30s had just struck a white middle-aged man across the face. He froze, one hand pressed to his cheek, eyes blinking fast, struggling to grasp what had just happened. Seconds earlier, at that very gas station, that same white man had hurled a stream of insults at the black cashier behind the counter. "You think I'm gonna pay for some fucking black bitch? You people should go back to whatever shitty part of Africa you crawled out of." His voice cut through the convenience store, loud and hostile, like he wanted everyone in the building to hear. There was no shame in his tone, only the cruel edge of someone used to going unchallenged. "What's wrong? Can't speak English? Or are you waiting for me to teach you a few things?" The cashier, a young black woman in a grease-stained red polo shirt with a plastic name tag, clenched her fists as if holding on to her dignity through sheer muscle. She didn't respond. She simply raised her chin, steady, like she refused to let his words drag her beneath the surface of her own humanity. 3 seconds later, silence. 5 seconds after that, the video ended. But when the clip hit TikTok, captioned, "Justice doesn't ask for permission," it exploded. 9 million views in under 12 hours. Thousands of comments pouring in. 3 hours later, the video was reposted by an official account, this time with a chilling declaration: "The right to react is still a right. It's time to make it law." Posted by Marjorie Taylor Greene. 48 hours later, MTG held a press conference. Before the cameras, she stood as if she'd just emerged from a crowd of the wronged, bringing with her a distilled fury, rebranded as policy. "We cannot keep punishing those who react justly to unjust insults. What we need is a legal framework, one that defends justified reflex." Right-wing media hailed it as a revolutionary breakthrough. Conservative outlets coined the term a moral framework for instinct. But the official name, submitted to Congress on the 5th day after the infamous slap, was colder, sharper. Typed in all caps: the Disproportionate Response Act. No one knew exactly when slapping became legislative architecture. Only that in the moment that black woman raised her hand, what she touched wasn't just the face of a racist, but the trembling line between justice and raw emotion. And once that line broke, what emerged wasn't righteousness. It was a storm, packaged and sold as law-backed outrage. By the second week after the gas station incident, America wasn't debating, it was reacting. A flurry of new videos popped up like mushrooms after rain, raw, unedited, without captions. In a Texas elementary school, a parent punched a school resource officer in the chest after being denied an explanation for why their daughter was detained after class. In a Seattle hospital, a Vietnamese man slapped a white patient after being called the Asian virus. At a Louisiana college dorm, a black student tackled a peer who had accused him of theft, without evidence. They all shared one thing. Each clip ended in applause from the bystanders. The Disproportionate Response Act, though not yet officially enacted, had already begun functioning as a provisional moral framework, as if any verbal offense now justified a slap, a punch, or a takedown, legitimized not by justice, but by sheer outrage. As always, the media landscape split cleanly down ideological lines, with no bridge in sight. Right-wing outlets hailed it as the era of honest reactions, romanticizing each blow as a bodily declaration of dignity. Progressives, on the other hand, found themselves paralyzed, too uncertain to criticize, for fear of being labeled apologists for bigotry. It was on MSNBC that Jasmine Crockett finally broke her silence. "I understand the anger. I felt it myself. I've stood in rooms where they assumed I was the help. But if we start writing laws based on emotion, then no one is safe, not even the vulnerable." She bowed her head slightly, letting the weight of that truth sit with the audience. She knew what it felt like to be reduced, to feel the rage well up from the pit of one's throat after being rendered invisible. And precisely because she understood that pain, she knew better than anyone. Emotion cannot be the blueprint for the Constitution. "Reaction isn't justice," she said. "It's justice, scratched raw, disfigured into impulse." And Jasmine knew what she had just offered wasn't a speech. It was a gentle tap, right on the frayed nerve of a society that had grown addicted to shouting just to be heard. 3 weeks after the Disproportionate Response Act was introduced, Jasmine began noticing patterns that didn't square with reality. Of the 36 violent incidents cited by conservative media in support of the bill, 29 involved victims of color, immigrants, or social advocates. Not all of them struck first, yet nearly all were labeled instigators, threats, or aggressors. What stood out most, in nearly every viral video, the camera began only after the action started, enough to capture the blow, but never what provoked it. Jasmine began gathering police reports from local departments, reviewing arrest records, and requesting data from state judicial offices where the trial version of the bill had been implemented. A pattern began to emerge. Those on the receiving end of these so-called righteous reactions often had no immediate legal counsel. No one spoke up for them in the media, and most alarmingly, no original footage was ever located. She knew she couldn't do this alone, not because she lacked the skills, but because the system never allows one of its own to expose its guts without trying to suffocate them first. So she reached out to an old contact. No real name, no bank account, just a PGP key last used during an NSA whistleblower operation 3 years ago. He was a ghost in the world of government leaks. If he still existed, he went by one name only, Key. 3 nights later, in a double encrypted call, Key's voice came through. Flat, dry, stripped of any humanity except for his scalpel-like grip on data. I ran a metadata sweep across the viral clips. 68% of them were uploaded from accounts only active between 2 and 4 a.m. Eastern. 92% shared the same audio compression pattern, but the most interesting thing is... What? Jasmine cut in gently, trying to stay composed. Facial recognition cameras on site flagged ID alerts to an encrypted IP node housed in a private server cluster, not local law enforcement. Jasmine sat motionless in the dim light of her Capitol Hill office, the glow from the laptop screen catching the rim of her eyes, already red from 4 straight hours of data review. She said nothing for minutes, because in her mind, these weren't isolated incidents anymore. They were by design, a system that knew exactly what it was doing. Key's final words before the line went dead were chilling. I don't know what you're up against, but this isn't a piece of legislation anymore. This has a design. Jasmine knew, and in that moment, for the first time, she called it by the name she had only whispered to herself before, Operation Mirror Glass. The House Judiciary hearing that morning was supposed to be a routine legislative formality, until Representative Jasmine Crockett stepped up to the podium, clutching a stack of documents that had never passed through any formal administrative channel. There was no preamble, no political throat clearing. She raised the first page and read clearly, firmly. In the 28 days since the Disproportionate Response Act was proposed, there have been 17 cases of severe bodily injury with no camera evidence to prove the initial act was provocative. 15 of those injured were people of color. 12 were unarmed, and all of them, every single one, were held for over 12 hours without legal counsel. A few lawmakers furrowed their brows. Others looked up from their phones to the screen above. She pressed forward, her voice sharp, measured like cross-examination. My question isn't whether this law is effective. I'm asking who it's designed to protect. Before anyone could react, the distinct sound of high heels echoed from the back of the chamber. Marjorie Taylor Greene entered the room with theatrical timing, calm, composed, a folder under her arm like a loaded weapon. She didn't take her seat. She requested special speaking privileges and was granted them without delay. Everything moved so smoothly, Jasmine could feel it. She had walked into a trap already set. MTG approached the projector, plugged in a flash drive, and hit play. On screen, a grainy clip from 2020. A closed-door meeting. Jasmine Crockett, surrounded by activists, her voice rising with conviction. We must stop the state's hand before it turns its own rage into a mechanism of control. But the clip ended there. The rest of the sentence was missing. The tension rising in her eyes froze mid-frame. A surgical edit. MTG turned back toward the room, smiling. This, she said, gesturing at Jasmine, is the same woman who claims emotional reactions aren't justice. and yet once urged us to stop the government from enforcing the law in the name of public safety. A murmur swept through the chamber. Some reporters scribbled furiously. On multiple live streams, a Chiron flashed, "Crockett? Soft on crime?" Less than 48 hours later, the phrase Crockett, criminal sympathizer, surged into the top 5 trending searches nationwide. Several witnesses who had previously cooperated with her office now contacted staffers, saying they no longer felt safe. 3 anonymous letters arrived. One of them contained a single unused bullet. At 1:23 a.m., her phone buzzed. A message. No name, no avatar. Just a line of text. I wrote the original algorithm. I never agreed for it to be used like this. Below was a string of coordinates. Static numbers, no signature, no encryption code, just a confession, or perhaps the last remaining thread, connecting to the synthetic heart behind Operation Mirrorglass. Jasmine Crockett sat alone in her auxiliary office on Capitol Hill. The room was dark. Her personal laptop sat disconnected from all networks. On the screen glowed a spreadsheet, not overly technical, but damning enough to stun any legislator with a shred of conscience. Key had left no name, just like always. A one-time download link, an encrypted code, and a single line of text. This is a behavioral risk assessment built by Kinetic Systems AI. They're using it as a filter, a sorting tool. Jasmine opened the file. Over 2,400 names. Most were people of color, immigrants, college students who had attended protests, or individuals who had posted politically on social media. Next to each name, a number. Reaction risk score, 8.4, 9.1, 9.7. According to Key, the system was designed to predict potential disruptors, using facial scans, social media history, crowd behavior metrics, and phone data correlations. In other words, it didn't wait for someone to break the law. It predicted who might become inconvenient. Jasmine wasn't surprised to see that many on the list had recently been labeled instigators in controversial incidents. She'd seen their names before, on Fox News banners like "Man Disrupts Peace in Dallas" or "Atlanta Teen Confronts Police." In truth, they had done nothing extreme. One had once held a protest sign. Another had shared an article about the right to fair treatment. Yet both had reaction risk scores above 9. And both had been responded to in precisely the scenarios Jasmine had feared all along. "They're not waiting for crime to happen," she murmured. "They're redefining what crime is, before anyone does anything wrong." She dug deeper into Kinetic Systems. One of its investment branches had previously received funding from the American Civil Security Fund, an organization Marjorie Taylor Greene was nominally the founding chair of. The chain of connection was no longer theoretical. MTG backed the law. The law created the excuse. The data chose the target. It was all scripted, clean, coded, and deniable. In the corner of her screen, a new file appeared. Siren Run List Version 3.csv. Jasmine opened it. A list of trigger scenarios, locations, assigned targets, and preset response activations. One line stopped her cold. Scenario 07B, school grounds. Target, black student, reacts harshly to teacher. Prompt parental escalation. She didn't need to read any further. The law was just the shell. The real engine behind the system was data. Data that had been weaponized. A special hearing was scheduled for Monday, 10 a.m. Room 2141 in the Capitol. A chamber that had borne both historic oaths and the quiet deaths of political careers. On Sunday night, Jasmine Crockett sat in front of her laptop, reviewing the witness list one final time. The first name was still there. Evan Torres, senior systems engineer at Kinetic. He had reached out to her through Key. Evan had helped write the core algorithm behind the high-risk behavior analysis system. During a private meeting in a safe house outside Arlington, he'd said only one sentence. "I didn't know the system would be used to silence people instead of protect them." Crockett had believed him. She'd staked the entire hearing on his appearance. But that morning, Evan didn't show up. No email, no call. His apartment was empty. No signs of forced entry, no note. A neighbor mentioned he'd left 2 days prior. looked calm, like he was following a schedule. Crockett knew exactly what that meant. Either Evan had backed out because he was afraid, or he had been persuaded to step away in the kind of language no politician ever dares to put into the record. Sitting in the hearing room, with rows of C-SPAN cameras in front of her and a distracted Congress behind her, preoccupied with campaign schedules and electoral math, Crockett knew there was no other option left. "They told me there's no case without a witness," she said, her voice steady, deliberate, firm. "But some things don't need a witness. They just need light." She opened her laptop and connected it to the projector. On the screen appeared a segment of the data Key had sent her, a list of individuals flagged as high risk, and the precise conditions under which they had been selected as targets within what the system called controlled social response scenarios. There were no tabloid names, no images of blood or chaos, just the stark, clinical clarity of an Excel sheet, the kind that cannot be denied once a human being has been reduced to a data point. "This isn't a public safety policy," she said, her voice unwavering. "This is a tool for sorting human beings, and it's operating under the mask of a so-called tech crime prevention law." A low murmur spread across the chamber. MTG wasn't in the room, but her allies began flipping through folders, reaching for their phones, signaling aides to step out of the room. In that instant, the machinery, carefully calibrated and long immune to disruption, lurched ever so slightly off rhythm. 2 hours later, copies of the file were in the inboxes of every major newsroom. The press moved quickly. Within hours, legal analysts, civil liberties experts, and tech columnists across the political spectrum had begun dissecting the data Crockett had released, not for shock value, but because it simply could not be ignored. The hearing room, usually a hive of side conversations, buzzing phones, and whispered negotiations, fell into an unusual hush. A few Republican lawmakers began reopening their files on kinetic systems. A congressman from Ohio quietly withdrew his support for the bill. A campaign attorney, once a loyal advisor to MTG, issued a public statement announcing his resignation from her affiliated organization. No one rose to defend Marjorie Taylor Greene, not because they had stopped believing in her, but because, for the first time, they weren't sure what exactly they were defending anymore. And as the sun dipped behind the Capitol dome, a single tweet surged to the top of the trending list. "Source code doesn't lie." Attached beneath it was a screenshot of the file, Siren Run List version 3.csv. The document went viral. The Capitol trembled. And for the first time, Marjorie Taylor Greene's armor began to crack. 3 days after the hearing, Marjorie Taylor Greene held a press conference on the steps of the Capitol, surrounded by a crush of reporters. She didn't waste time with pleasantries. In her hand was a red folder stamped with a bold black label. "Federal Data Security Violation. Congresswoman Jasmine Crockett has released classified documents, materials not vetted by any federal agency," she declared, her tone measured but icy. "What she's done isn't just a breach of protocol, it's a betrayal of the American public's trust." She spoke the words like a sentence handed down from a bench, and the conservative media machine responded instantly. Right-wing outlets dubbed Crockett a New Age Snowden, but with political ambition instead of principle. Those who once stood behind her fell silent. The political center, meanwhile, hesitated. The House Ethics Committee called an emergency session, and by Thursday afternoon, the vote was in. A temporary suspension of Jasmine Crockett's position on the House Judiciary Committee. 6 votes in favor, 5 opposed. It all unfolded as if the machinery of politics had suddenly reversed its course, and this time, it turned back toward the old guard, toward MTG, the woman who had long mastered the art of weaponizing outrage into strategy. But that very evening, a 91-second video surfaced without warning, on TikTok, then on Twitter. No color correction, no background music, just a single unfiltered shot. A white woman, perhaps in her early 40s, sat in a dim kitchen, her hand trembling slightly as she held a coffee cup. Her voice was soft, like she was confessing something she'd never planned to say aloud. "My name is Diane. I live in Kentucky. I used to vote for MTG." She paused. "Last week, my son, he's 16, was walking home from school when 2 strange men approached him. They told him he'd been flagged as high-risk behavior because he once shared a post about George Floyd online. They threatened to call the police. My son has no record. He's never been in trouble. He's the kind of kid who gets nervous during classroom debates. But the neighborhood camera caught it all. They followed him from the end of the block. And I found his name on the spreadsheet released by Congresswoman Crockett. Diane's voice broke slightly. The video cut briefly to a still photo. Her son, thin, wearing a backpack, standing against a brick wall, frozen in fear as two men blocked his path. I used to believe MTG was protecting families like mine. But if even my son isn't safe under her law, maybe it's time I ask myself, who exactly have I been calling a hero? The clip ended on a single line, no soundtrack, no edits, just the truth laid bare. If my child can be misidentified because of one post, then none of us are citizens anymore. We're just data. Within just 12 hours, the video had been shared more than 3 million times. And for the first time in weeks, the silence began to fracture. Not from critics or activists, but from those who had once stood firmly behind Marjorie Taylor Greene. A closed-door meeting was quietly convened in a small basement room beneath a nondescript hotel near Capitol Hill. There were no nameplates, no staffers taking notes, no journalists lurking in corners. Only Jasmine Crockett, a handful of trusted advisors, a seasoned tech strategist who had worked on federal-level campaigns, and Key, connected remotely via an encrypted link. Spread across the table was the latest internal projection from the legislative office. 196 votes against, 218 in favor, and 21 undecided. Not enough to repeal the law through standard congressional procedure. Most swing vote representatives had already retreated into defensive mode, viewing the battle not through the lens of justice, but through the cold calculus of midterm optics. Then a new message from Key appeared on the screen. They've locked in every premium digital ad slot for the next 48 hours. YouTube, Meta, TikTok, even Amazon Fire TV. They're going to shape voter sentiment before anyone can get the truth out. Crockett's eyes stayed fixed on the screen. She understood perfectly. The narrative war had already begun, and they were late to the battlefield. If they didn't act now, the truth would be buried under money and machine learning. If Congress won't listen, she said, calm but resolved, then the people will. An open hearing, live-streamed, unedited, unfiltered. She looked around the room, not to seek permission, but to see who still had the stomach to walk the rest of this road with her. We'll let the victims speak. No lawyers, no scripting. If it fails, I'll take the fall alone. Silence settled over the room, but no one left. Before disconnecting, Key sent one final message. I'll keep the uplink stable, even if the power goes out. That night, no one slept. Each person held a piece of the plan. Someone securing the uplink location, someone building a standalone broadcast pipeline, someone reaching out to victims who had been misidentified by the system. No one knew whether the public still wanted to hear the truth, but they all understood. If they didn't speak now, there might never be another chance. That evening, the group left the hotel in silence, scattering in different directions like strangers passing on the street. But in each of their minds, the plan was already fully formed, down to the smallest beat. They wouldn't rely on traditional media. They wouldn't wait for permission from the system. Within the next 24 hours, they secured a vacant space inside an old warehouse in Alexandria. Quiet enough to avoid press attention, spacious enough to set up camera equipment, and cheap enough not to require a sponsor. Back at her congressional office, Crockett instructed her staff to clear the entire schedule for the upcoming week. No explanation given. One communications advisor leaned in and whispered, "If this fails, you won't just lose your seat, you'll lose your footing." She didn't answer, because she had already accounted for that possibility. By now, social media was nearing its breaking point. The right had escalated its Defend Your Right to Respond campaign, pumping money into primetime cable slots and digital ad blitzes. But something else was beginning to fracture. Among the politically uncommitted, questions were starting to emerge. If the government won't show us the full picture, who will? And then a new wave of commentary began spreading, from people who normally tune politics out. Why does Congress only listen to each other and not to us? Under that pressure, Crockett realized the open hearing was no longer a strategy. It was the last obligation they still had left. The live stream began at 7 p.m. Eastern. No network backdrop, no judge, no procedural votes. Just a plain white room, a few straight-backed wooden chairs, a single fixed camera. Crockett didn't take the podium. She sat at the center, facing each person as they stepped forward to speak. The first was a young Latino man. He told of the night he was flagged as high risk by an AI system, simply for walking past a protest. Police showed up at his house near midnight, armed with a behavioral warrant, but no evidence, other than his expression, caught on a neighborhood surveillance feed. Next came a Korean-American nurse, misidentified by facial recognition as someone once accused of inciting a crowd. Then a black 11th grader stood up, his voice shaking slightly. "I don't know what I did wrong. I just wanted to get home after school." None of the stories were long, but each was clear, and no one interrupted. No one spoke for them. Crockett was the last to speak. There was no script, no soaring rhetoric. She simply looked into the lens, like she was speaking to a child in her family. "We live in a country where laws are meant to protect the vulnerable, not decide in advance who's weak and push them out." She paused. Let the silence settle. Justice isn't the right to slap someone. It's having enough dignity that you don't need to. Over the next hour, the live stream was shared more than 3 million times. CNN, BBC, and NHK picked up the story. International headlines described it as an unscripted civic event without producers or Polish, yet powerful enough to rattle the scaffolding of legislation. In her West Capitol office, Marjorie Taylor Greene watched a replay of the clip in silence. She didn't push back, didn't tweet, didn't appear on any network. 3 days passed. Still, silence. But this time, something had shifted. Control had changed hands. After weeks of bitter conflict, Congress reconvened for a closed-door session that stretched over 8 hours. No cameras, no press releases. Just ballot cards laid down, one by one, each heavier than the last. The result, the Disproportionate Response Act, was formally suspended from enforcement. A federal investigation was opened, probing the links between kinetic systems, government tech contracts, and the political action groups that had funded MTG's legislative campaign. The Department of Justice assigned a special task force to investigate the abuse of citizen surveillance infrastructure. The media called it the first rollback after 3 years of unregulated tech acceleration. And the headlines stopped asking whether Crockett was right. They began asking why it took so long for someone to say it with that much clarity. But Crockett didn't step onto any victory stage. There were no medals, no standing ovations, no panel appointments. Her office still received death threats, tucked between handwritten thank you notes. The inbox still overflowed, but this time many of the letters said only one thing: "Thank you. Because of you, I no longer feel alone in the data." Marjorie Taylor Greene didn't vanish from the political stage. She still had her platform, still drew a loyal audience. But she no longer held a seat on any legislative committee related to technology or civil affairs. She called it a political punishment. The public called it something else: accountability. That afternoon, a thin rain began to fall, like strands of silver thread sliding down the stone steps of the Capitol. Jasmine Crockett walked out the main doors. No security detail. No applause. She pulled her coat tighter, hands tucked into her pockets, eyes fixed ahead, toward a street slowly disappearing beneath the mist. She didn't hold her head high, but she didn't lower it either. That walk didn't belong to someone who had won, but clearly, it didn't belong to someone who had lost. A young reporter followed her for a few quiet steps. No questions, just lifted a voice recorder toward her, as if asking, not for a quote, but for a final breath. And Jasmine Crockett said softly, almost to herself, "The price of justice isn't victory. It's not losing yourself along the way."